All right. Hello, DerbyCon. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm here today to talk about a presentation, bad advice, unintended consequences, and broken paradigms. Think and act different. Wanted to mention that the DerbyCon conference almost rhymes with my name, so I changed the slide to WerbyCon. So there's a lot of things that I've encountered in my career that have constituted failures, and I'm going to list a few of them here. Don't have a strategy or a vision or a mission or a target state or a roadmap. Don't understand risk. Serve as an obstacle because we don't align with the business. Don't engage our stakeholders. Scream about irrelevant vulnerabilities. We want to solve everything with shiny things, yet we don't know how our shiny things work, and we only use a fraction of the capabilities that exist in our shiny toys. We can't state how effective we are, but we think we're right and that they're wrong. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's also the definition of information security. Every presentation has to have a disclaimer, so my disclaimer today is actually an MD5 hash of my disclaimer. So if you can reverse it, fantastic. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but suffice to say it's the same as everyone else's, so just implicitly, I have the same disclaimer everyone else has. So who am I? My name is Steve Werby. I'm not a rock star. I'm not a guru. I'm not a thought leader. I've been in the information security field since 1999. I started off doing hands-on technical work, and for the last 7 years, I've been doing information security management and security architecture. I currently work as a security architect at a Fortune 500 firm. My 3 previous roles were as chief information security officers at 3 large organizations. So I think it's important to level set and talk about what information security is. There's a lot of definitions out there, but they all pretty much boil down to this. Information security is the practice of defending information against unauthorized access, use, disclosure, modification, or destruction. I actually believe this is a more apt description of what information security is. It's the defense of information in IT systems in alignment with stakeholders' direction for addressing risk and opportunities, with opportunities being key and something that we often overlook in our field. The business is engaged in providing services and selling products, typically, or something along those lines. They have a forward-thinking view and often have opportunities that they want to take advantage of. It's important as security practitioners that we find out what those opportunities are and that we attempt to align our information security strategy and approach with those opportunities. So to break this down a little bit more, we need to find out what information we have, what IT systems use that information, who our stakeholders are, what our risks are, and what the opportunities are that exist within our organization. So for example, when I talk about opportunities, it could be that in your organization, there are people that are in product development that have a $150 million idea, an idea that could generate $150 million in revenue. If you don't know about that, and perhaps that idea requires leveraging the cloud, you may be the type of security practitioner that says, we cannot leverage the cloud is insecure. Well, you may have just put the kibosh on a $150 million idea. The approach that I recommend that you consider is finding out what that $150 million idea is and how it can be implemented in a way that is secure enough to meet the requirements of the organization. BYOD is another good example. A lot of organizations are trying to recruit individuals from the millennial generation. Many of them expect that they can use whatever device they want whenever they want. If you're in one of those types of organizations and you say, we can't use BYOD, it's insecure, you're potentially telling your organization that it cannot hire qualified people that it needs to hire in order for it to be successful. All right, it's a little hard for me to read this on my screen, but this is something that I found in a KPMG report, and I thought it was really nice in sort of demonstrating the difference between how we operate as a field and how a jeweler operates. So I'm going to have to bend down to look at it a little bit more closely. On the left-hand side is the jeweler. I know what assets to protect and have set up the appropriate measures. In our field, we would say, I take measures without having a clear idea of the assets it is essential for us to protect. I'm not going to read through all these, but I'll skip through to the middle. When it goes wrong or almost goes wrong, I learn a lesson. What we say is, when it goes wrong or almost goes wrong, I panic. I invest in tools because they assist the continuity of my business. I invest in tools because it is mandatory and because the media reports on incidents every day. So we're very reactive, very ad hoc as an industry or as a field. We don't often measure what we do. We do things without knowing if they're successful or not. And we really need to get away from that. And I'm going to talk more about that later. But it's not just us that are to blame, it's also our stakeholders. And here's a model I put together that starts from immature at the bottom and works its way up to mature. At the bottom, I have, how do you let this happen? So that's your CEO or CIO finding out something occurred and jumping down your throat and asking how you let that event occur. How can we prevent this in the future? Should we address this? What's our risk for scenarios I read about? What do you think we should do? How can we align with the org's objectives? I would say most of the organizations that people I know work at or have worked with tend to be in the bottom half of this immaturity scale. We need to move our way towards the top. And it really involves just engaging our stakeholders and explaining to them what information security is, why it should be important to them, and trying to align with the business. And you have the ability to influence this. I want to get into a little bit of bad advice. There's a lot of things that we do as a field that we've been doing repeatedly. We know that they don't work well, yet we continue to do them. Let's take passwords as an example. We ask our users to make them complex, we tell them to memorize them, and we ask them to change them regularly. But really, that's not really what we want. What we really want is certain outcomes. We want to ensure that the password that they create cannot be guessed by somebody who's unauthorized. There's potentially better ways to do that. We really want them to be hard to guess. We don't really need them to memorize them. We just want them to protect them. And I'll give you an example of something else that we all do that doesn't involve memorizing things. So in my wallet, I have a credit card. You all probably have credit cards in your wallet. You don't memorize your credit card numbers. You may have them memorized, but you don't really need to. We all feel very comfortable walking around with our credit cards and our debit cards in our wallets because we tend to keep them on ourselves. You can do the same thing with passwords. The whole idea of not writing them down is really not what we need to advocate. We need to advocate that if they do write them down, they do it in a secure way and they protect them. Now, if you look into academic research around changing passwords regularly, it doesn't actually have a lot of merit, and that's because theoretically it makes a lot of sense because you can reduce the amount of time that an individual who's guessed a password has access to it, and if somebody performs an offline attack, you reduce the amount of time that they have available to guess the password. But the reality is that individuals who have to rotate their passwords follow typical behavior. And so they often will take a password and change it slightly. They will create a worse password than they might have otherwise created if they didn't have to change them every 42 to 90 days. And the academic research actually supports that this doesn't actually provide us a lot of value. And when you think about how computing power has increased over the last 5 or 10 years, the difference between being able to crack a password in 90 days versus 360, it's really a moot point. If you're going to crack a password, you're most likely going to be able to do it in seconds or minutes or hours. So you're not really buying a whole lot by forcing the individuals to change their passwords on a regular basis. So when we take these kinds of approaches to things like passwords, we end up having compliant password use, but the individuals create weak passwords that are reused or similar to previous passwords they created. They write them down, but they don't protect them well because we don't tell them how to protect them because we want them to memorize them. And then they only change them if they're forced, and when they do so, they increment them or rotate their passwords. So they're finding workarounds to adhere to the policies and practices we put in place, but we don't spend the time to find out what they're actually doing and to find out that our controls are not actually working. So instead, here are some different ways you can think about passwords and things you could do. The easiest thing to have your users do is create long passwords. And I do a lot of password cracking research and password analysis research. And I can say that by and large, you're better to have your users create very long passwords that are not complex than you are to have them create complex passwords that are shorter. I, in a previous organization, advocated that we move to passphrases. We had 50,000 users. It took me about a year to convince the organization to do this, and the way that I did it actually was to present two alternatives. One that required them to change their passwords more regularly, but to create passwords that were longer and still complex, and another to allow them to create a 15-character passphrase with no composition or complexity requirements that never had to be changed for any other reason than a compromise or a role change or something that was event-driven. The stakeholders were not very fond of this idea until I demonstrated that it was actually going to be easier for them. Their initial thought was, if I have to create a 15-character password, it's going to take me a lot more time to create and type it in. But the reality is, you don't spend a lot of time over the course of a day typing a password in. And if you create a passphrase, it's easier to remember and you actually can type it in more quickly, especially when you consider devices like mobile devices like phones or smart tablets or smartphones, where it's often difficult to find symbols or to find the shift key. And so when I implemented this in this organization, the average password that was created ended up being 19 characters, even though the minimum was 15. And you might say, Steve, well, there's still the possibility if your adversary knew that, they would just create password attacks that involve lowercase letters, because most of the users were probably using lowercase letters. But the reality is that most adversaries don't know what your password policy is. So if they're going to try 8-character passwords, then move on to 9, and you have users that have 19-character passwords, they may never actually try a 19-character password. So another thing you could do, and this is not very easy to pull off successfully, but it would be to require a Unicode character. So there are about 110,000 characters in the Unicode character set. Most password cracking activities do not involve Unicode characters, so simply by having one Unicode character in your password, you're going to defeat pretty much every password attack that exists. Another thing that you can do is audit your passwords. So your adversaries are, in essence, auditing your passwords by running brute force attacks or mailing rules or other forms of attacks against your passwords. Why aren't you? So you can potentially run your own internal auditing, and when you detect a password that one of your users is using that is weak, force it to be changed and educate them on how to create a much stronger password. So here's just some examples of what long passwords would look like. Oh, I skipped over common topologies, and I have a link to some research done by CoreLogic. So topology is, in essence, a pattern that a password exhibits. So CoreLogic looked at 10 years worth of data from their customer engagements and looked at whether each individual position of the passwords they cracked was an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, a number, or a symbol, and then looked at those topologies. And so the most common one in most organizations is going to be an uppercase letter followed by 6 or 7 lowercase letters followed by a number, or a number followed by a symbol, depending on what the password policy is. And their research indicated that though there are 65,000 or so topologies involving 8-character passwords, the reality is about 10 different topologies in most organizations represent about 80% to 90% of what the passwords actually are. So if you can force your users not to use the most common topologies, you're going to substantially, by orders of 5 magnitudes, reduce the likelihood that a password cracker is going to crack their passwords. So in other words, they've reported out what the top 100 password topologies look like. Simply by ensuring that your users do not utilize those topologies, adversaries that are aware of what those topologies are and utilize them to do password cracking would have a much harder time cracking the passwords in your environment. So these types of things are not rocket science. It's just a matter of doing them. Okay. So another broken paradigm that exists in our field is policy. We create a lot of policy. It's very verbose. Lawyers can understand it. Some of the time, we as information security practitioners can understand it, but our end users can't understand our policy. And they don't read it because it's extremely long, so it's only really good as a CYA. So whenever one of our users does something that violates policy, we slap on the wrist, tell them they violate a policy. But that's not really what we want. We want them to know what they need to do or not do in order to be secure. So we need policy that's comprehensible, retainable. So by retainable, I mean it has to be fairly concise because the attention span of most people today is very short. And in addition to telling them what to do and what not to do, it really should tell them why. So simply telling them to create a complex password and not to reuse them doesn't do a lot of good. You need to provide more information. So this is an example of sort of a model for how I would typically approach creating a password policy in an organization. So the text would look something like this. Create a password which isn't guessable by someone who knows you or is similar to one you currently use or have previously used here or anywhere else. It's very straightforward. Protect it by never sharing it with anyone, being wary of phishing attacks, and by memorizing it or writing it down in a secure way. Now, within a policy itself, you would not normally explain what a secure way is. You would have a standard or operating procedure that does that. But here's what's different than most policies that I've seen, is I'm advocating actually explaining to them why. So adversaries are good at tricking people and using their knowledge of typical approaches for constructing passwords. Don't let them gain access to your personal accounts, info, or the company information you have access to. So what I like to do is make it personal. I really think in most organizations, people want to do the right thing, but they really care more about themselves and their information in their systems more than they do about your information in your systems. So, if you can teach them how to be secure in their personal life, it's likely they'll carry over into the business world and everybody wins. Okay. So we're all very familiar with the CIA Triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I actually think that's wrong, and I realize we call it CIA, and it probably was put in that particular order because there's a federal agency called CIA, so it's much easier to remember. But I think we're actually doing ourselves and our stakeholders a service by referring to it that way. I think it's better by default to call it AIC. And I say that because the stakeholders I've talked to typically are more interested in the availability of their systems than they are the confidentiality of their data. They're also more interested in ensuring the integrity of the data. If the data is bad or is not what is expected to be, then the system's not very usable. Sure, they do care about confidentiality, and this is not to say there aren't exceptions to the rule. If you talk to somebody in HR, they probably want to ensure that social security numbers and other PII are protected. But I believe in most organizations, you provide a service and you produce products and you sell them. And it's usually very important for your systems to be available. So I'd encourage you to potentially think whether in your organization the C is really the most important thing. And I found in many organizations, not only is C seen as the most important, it's sometimes the only thing that some organizations look at. So I'm just kind of flipping it on its side and saying AIC may be the way to go. Now, there's an individual called Parker who came up with something called the Parkerian hexad, which has 6 atomic elements to it. And I do like his model a bit better. But I decided if Parker can have a model, why can't Steve Werby? So I came up with a Werbian quintet. Now, it's not really any different than Parker's because all I really did was took 2 of his and slammed them together. And that's confidentiality and possession. I did that because when I've talked to stakeholders, they really don't care about the difference between confidentiality and possession. So the difference really means is I could have a laptop that's encrypted and the data remains confidential if somebody gets hold of my laptop, but they have possession to my laptop if they take my laptop. So that's what possession is. So if they were able to get the encryption key, they could then compromise the confidentiality of that information. And since in many organizations we fool ourselves into believing that our laptops are secure because they're encrypted, though we often encrypt them with the same enterprise password we use for everything else, so now you have an attack vector of compromising a user via phishing or social engineering or some mechanism like malware. And if they get a hold of the laptop or device, they now actually can bypass the encryption. So by incorporating the possession into the model, it recognizes that possession is actually fairly important to us as information security practitioners. So what I've done is split the model up into 3 components. I believe in most organizations, level 1, utility and availability are the most important, and I'm using utility to mean the utility of the system. Is it actually usable? Plus the utility of the security control. So if we take something like encryption in mind, an individual can't remember the decryption key because there's no key escrow, the data will remain confidential, but is no longer usable, so that's what utility is. So this is something I'm going to come back to later, but I call it the quartet of doom. These are the 4 security controls that we've been working with for a very long time in information security that I believe are largely ineffective. Passwords, firewalls, OS patching, and antivirus. So what I want you to do is think about these 4 controls and think about what they're intended to accomplish and whether it's possible there may be other controls that would be as effective or more effective. We're going to walk through this later, but I wanted you to start thinking about it. So I believe as a field, we really don't have the balls to replace these controls. I'm curious, is anyone in this audience completely eliminated the use of any one of these 4 controls? Okay, so I didn't see anyone raise a hand. That's what I expected. We'll come back to this later. All right, so I just want to take a moment to show you a couple of comic strips that I thought were relevant to the conversation today. So I mentioned earlier that it's important to have a strategy, and I think this is very indicative of organizations that don't have a security program that's mature. They don't have a strategy. You really need to have a mission which leads to a vision for a future state, a strategy that helps you actually get to the point where you're close to achieving your vision. You need to look and see what your future target state will look like. You need to look at what your current state is and then identify the gaps to create a roadmap to get you from point A to point B. If you're not doing that, you're really flying blind. And even if you're not in a position where you have the authority or you have the role that allows you to look at an enterprise strategy and create it, I think it's important to actually adopt this as a mindset. You can start off very simple, but just think about what you want your organization to be from an information security perspective. Think about what you're doing right now and what it would actually take to get there. This does not have to be very complex. It can be complex, but you can start off very simple. And here's one last comic I wanted to show you. It has to do with password strength. The individual is trying to create a password. They have a difficult time with it. They eventually create it, and they find out that the aging requirement is for the password to be changed the next day. So we do these kinds of things in our organizations without understanding what the impact is to our users. It's very frustrating to them. And it should be frustrating to you as a user too. I know I want to say that I can eat my own dog food. I hate it when I work in an organization that forces me to change my password every 90 days because I can create a really good password that's unique. I don't use it anywhere else, and I can memorize it. And then 90 days later, I have to do it again, and it's just really annoying, and it's not providing any value. Okay, so I'm going to talk about risk management, but before I do, I just want to talk about our vulnerability management-centric approach that many of us have adopted. And before I explain my risk assessment model, which is not really something new, it's something you've all seen before, on the outside of it is threats on the left, and on the right are impacts. And with my pea brain, I ask myself, if there's a system that I'm looking at and there is no possible impact, or the impact's very insignificant, is there really a risk? And I believe the answer is no. So as we're looking at vulnerabilities and they come out and we run our scans and we generate these reports and we look at them, we really need context. Because if there's not an impact or there's not threats that may materialize, there is not really a risk. And so I have a couple examples I think demonstrate that. Let's say that you have a parking lot full of cars and your car is unlocked, it's 20 years old, it's beaten up, and there's nothing inside of it. Well, one risk that exists in parking lots is people walk through parking lots looking for items in cars. They look through the windows to see what's sitting inside the car. and they'll break the window or pick the lock or find some other way to get in. Well, my 20-year-old beat-up car, or they'll steal the car. I'm not worried about anyone stealing the car. It has no value. There's hundreds of other cars that are better to steal. And there's nothing inside the car. So I don't really care if somebody opens up the door and looks in or goes inside. There is no potential impact to me. So there is a threat. There are people that walk around the parking lots looking for cars to steal and things to take. But there is no impact. So to take the opposite end of the spectrum, let's assume that there's a house just in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and that we know that it has $10 million in diamonds in the middle of the house, sitting on the table in the kitchen, and only one person knows it's there. There's a possible impact if somebody gets in that house, and there's no one at the house, there's no security controls whatsoever. Somebody finds the house, they can walk in and steal $10 million worth of diamonds, but there's not really a threat. Because people that are looking to steal diamonds and break into houses are not looking for a house in the middle of the Sahara Desert they don't know exists. And even if they knew it existed, they wouldn't suspect that there'd be $10 million of diamonds in there, so there is no threat. So context is critical. So you've already all seen these models before, risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. I really don't think it's the best model. It's fairly good if you're going to start with something. You can also think of it as risk equals the likelihood of something times the impact of that something. Now, the problem with these models is they don't really recognize that there's a lot of different impacts. If you take something like your employee database that has personally identifiable information in it, well, without context, a lot of organizations focus on the worst case scenario. There's 1 million people that work at my company. If somebody gets into the database, they could steal 1 million records. That's true. If the asset they're going after is the database and they have an attack vector that lets them get in, but another attack vector is to gain access to the application for an authenticated user has access to their one single record. Well, if you focus on the confidentiality, it's PII, it's confidential, you need to protect it. But the reality is it's a much different potential risk if it's 1 million records that are potentially stolen out of the back-end database than if it's one record stolen out of the application. And so when we think about these scenarios, it's really a number of scenarios that are over a complete spectrum. I don't find it's really important to enumerate the entire spectrum because the reality of what you're trying to do is understand a level. Is this a high risk, a medium risk, or a low risk, or whatever your taxonomy is? What controls should I have in place that would mitigate the risk to a level that's acceptable? And am I where I should be? And that's what you're really trying to do. And so a lot of organizations I found focus on the worst case scenario, but the worst case scenario is not really the likely scenario. And so this chart on the right is something you also probably commonly see a lot. If something has a high impact and a high likelihood, ends up in the red section of the chart, which means it's something you probably should address. If it's in the bottom left, it's green, which means you're okay. If it's yellow, it's somewhere in the middle. If you can get around to it, you would try to mitigate it, or you monitor it to see if it eventually moves into the red. Okay, so a lot of what we've been doing just really doesn't work. So here's something that's a bit of an eye chart. What I did was I leveraged some other things that are out there. It's actually a graphic from the OWASP top 10 that I've modified a bit. But in essence, you have threat actors that utilize attack vectors to exploit vulnerabilities and bypass your controls, which results in a technical impact, which causes a business impact. And I have a lot of other information on this chart because it's something that I've been using in organizations I've worked in to have a conversation with people that don't understand information security. So it's a part model, part lexicon, so that we're all speaking the same language, so that they're not just viewing security as something that's O-days and DDoS attacks and language they don't understand. They understand things like hacking and malware and physical attacks and social engineering. And if they don't, it's very easy to get them to the point where they understand that type of language. But it's very hard from a risk assessment perspective to work from left to right and actually gain some value from this. So I actually like to work it a little bit differently. And I mentioned before, starting on the outside, what I like to do is start with impacts and threats. If there aren't any, I'm done. So this is a system-centric approach. You can also use this on a more holistic enterprise-wide type approach, but right now I'm talking about systems. So once I know what the impacts and the threats are, then I like to look at what the likelihood of an exploitation will be. So I start looking at attack vectors and the likelihood of an attack vector being utilized. Then I move on to iteration 3, which involves looking at the controls that are in place, the residual risk or the risk that's left over after those controls are put in place, and compare it to the risk appetite. The risk appetite is probably the trickiest part of the model because we as security practitioners should not be the ones that are determining what the risk appetite of the organization is. So this is where you really need to involve your stakeholders to ask them, this bad thing that could happen, how bad would it be for the organization? Would it be catastrophic? Would it put us completely out of business? Or would it just be a bit of an inconvenience or somewhere in between? You need to start having that dialogue. So once you have that dialogue, you can talk about scenarios and determine what their appetite for risk is and compare that to the controls you have in place and residual risk. If their appetite for risk is higher than residual risk, you're good to go. If it's lower, then you need to go through the model again in iteration 4 and look at defining new controls that reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And from there, it's really just a matter of prioritization and looking to see if you have the appropriate budget and all the fun stuff that we really don't like to do. And even if you can't do this, even if you can't get anything done, at least you have something documented now where you've talked to the stakeholders and said, look, here's what the risk is, and you own the risk. You told us what the impacts were that were important. You've come up with the levels of risk. We talked about what the risk appetite is and what the controls are we have in place. And you said you aren't comfortable with it. It's not my fault if the organization doesn't have a budget to address it and I don't have the resources in terms of people, tools, and capabilities. If you want it to be addressed, help me address those gaps. Okay. So you probably gather by now that I like to use models. So this is a model that I call a threat actor motivation likelihood matrix. And this one, instead of being system specific, is more organizational focused. And so what I've done is I've taken threat actors, put them into various categories, because I really don't care if it's a criminal that's part of the Russian business network versus part of some other criminal gang. They all probably have the same TTPs, the same approach for performing attacks, and the same end game in mind. They want to steal information to perform financial fraud. They all behave in a very similar way. So across the top are the motivations, and I'm not saying that you wouldn't have potentially different motivations in your organizations or a different way to reflect it. This is really about the mental model more so than whether my model is right for you. But this is something that I use to have a conversation with people in a small or large organization to say, look, an insider may perform information theft. It's much less likely that an insider is going to do something to disrupt the organization. They would do that if they were disgruntled, but a normal insider is not going to do something intentionally to disrupt the organization. Yes? So partner, good question. So that means like a business partner or supplier, so someone that's your upstream or downstream supplier, consulting agency that you work with, somebody that's an authorized partner of yours, could be a contractor, somebody that should have access to either your physical location or your data and systems, but still poses a potential risk to you. So, good question. And so when you start to look at this, and I've color-coded it as a bit of a heat map, you start to see that certain threat actors are extremely unlikely to exhibit a certain motivation. So activists are not in the business of committing financial crime. They don't try to hack into your systems and steal your credit card numbers. So when you start to move on to talk about specific systems, you can overlay this type of model to say, this is a system that involves financial information. Who do I think the threat actors are, and what are their motivations? And then from there, I would have a different model that looks at the attack vectors and what their capabilities are. And you might have some idea of what the threat actors are for your systems, but your stakeholders should have a very good idea as well. I'm not saying you're always going to agree, and I'm not saying they're always going to be smart or that you are either. But using a model like this and getting the right people in the room, you will usually come up with a list of threat actors, motivations, and attack vectors that are pretty reasonable. Much more reasonable than if you simply say, I need to get some DLP. We need to get some of that DLP, or we need some next generation firewall because Gartner or somebody told me that we need it. You need some context. Okay, so a big way that I like to look at information security is by asking questions. So I'm going to talk about some different ways that I like to ask questions. One way is to get direction. Are we meeting stakeholder expectations? And I have some sub-questions to really determine whether we are. One, who are our stakeholders? If you don't know who your stakeholders are, I can pretty much guarantee you're not meeting your stakeholders' expectations. And so you move south on this list, you become more mature. So what has the feedback been from your stakeholders? You only get there once you've defined who they are and you start to have conversations with them. You've explained information security and risk to them, and you've solicited some information and gotten some feedback. So it takes a while to get there, but you can start small by first identifying who your stakeholders are. And even if you're not the right person or don't think you're the right person, I'm pretty sure most of you can go through the process in 5 minutes determine that our lawyers might be stakeholders. IT audit is always telling us what we need to do, so maybe they're a stakeholder. It's pretty easy to figure out what your classes of stakeholders are. Okay, you can also use a question-based approach to do risk scenarios. So I like to just come up with off-the-wall risk scenarios, either by myself or by sitting down with other people I work with. So here's one for you. What if someone stole the CEO's laptop while he was using it at the park? Do any of you have a technical solution for that? Have any of you thought about that scenario? Okay, so some of you have. So later on, I'm going to actually talk about what some controls are for that scenario. I believe if you're an immature organization and you don't think about these scenarios, this bad thing will happen to you. And when this bad thing happens to you, someone's going to say, how'd you let this happen? Much better to have actually walked through the scenario, document it, tell the CIO or some other stakeholder, we have this risk. I don't necessarily think it's very likely, but it is a risk and we don't have a control for it. But it's not just asking whether you have a control, it's what if this thing happens? So you have preventive and detective controls and you have incident management. What if this happened? What would you do? So now this plays into your incident response program. I think it's a good idea to ask yourself, what would you do in this scenario before it actually does happen? Because then you're going to be scrambling. You're not going to have the right people together to figure out who to ask to find out what systems the CEO had access to and everything else that you need to do. So over the course of the year, you can do a lot of this work is just on the back of a napkin or a tabletop. It's not really hard to do. So also you need to ask yourself questions around your capabilities. What percentage of your critical vulnerabilities for systems in your environment are exploited in the wild before they've been remediated? Now, take the same question, but ask yourself, for those that have been exploited in our environment, if you don't know, how do you know that you're patching the right things frequently enough? So a lot of organizations will patch every 90 days or every 30 days. 30 and 90 are not magic numbers. You've been doing them every 30 or 90 days because that's what everybody else does, and maybe PCI says you need to do it every 30 days. But what you really need to find out is, how soon are the vulnerabilities in your environment being exploited? And that's really, to a degree, what you base your frequency of deploying your patches on. So if your vulnerabilities are always being exploited within 30 minutes of them being discovered, and you're always patching 90 days later, and by the time you patch, if it's something like Java, there's a new version, and the version you patch no longer matters because there's now new exploit kits for the version that you patch to, you're not really doing any good. You might be reporting out metrics that show, yep, we patched everything within 90 days and you can pat yourselves on the back, but you're not necessarily achieving the outcomes that you probably want to achieve. So how might we reduce the percentage of this thing occurring from X to Y is the kind of question I like to ask. Now, you can also do this to assess your controls. What if an attacker enumerated all of our AD accounts to intentionally lock them out? Ooh, that's not a very good one. Well, most people I've talked to in the organizations, what's going to happen is every single one of the AD accounts is going to get locked out. So the AD account that runs your customer support system, locked out, so none of your customers can get in. The AD account that runs your equipment to produce your widgets, locked out, can't make any widgets. And now you're asked, well, how did you let that happen? So you probably should ask yourself, are there preventive or detective controls in place that would mitigate that? Do you know what the impact would be? Is there an incident response plan for the scenario? How long will the incident take to contain? What was the objective of the control that we did have in place, and is the objective being met? So some of you probably have controls in place that lock an account out after 5 failed logins within 15 minutes for either an indefinite period or a period of something like 15 minutes. Why do you do that? Someone want to tell me why you do that? What is it you're trying to defend against? Brute force attacks. So it's against online brute force attacks. But the reality is in 2014, against an organization's corporate systems, there aren't really very many online brute force attacks. There's phishing attacks, there's malware that compromises systems and does keyloggers or man-in-the-mills, and there's offline attacks. So there's ways to do this that would be a whole lot better that would not have that unintended consequence. So attack trees are something that I like to look at. So we go back to the scenario of, well, this is actually a new scenario. Let's say you have individuals traveling to China. One of them is the CEO, and your organization says, Steve, we're sending people to China. Can you reduce the Chinese risk? Well, what is the Chinese risk? Is there really a risk? What exactly is it? So one potential risk is maybe your CEO has access to your trade secret data. And what this model and attack tree does is looks at all the ways that somebody could get access to your trade secret data. And it's sort of an and/or type exercise. So one way would be to kidnap the CEO who has access to a computer and get the data off it. So that's something you might want to think about, and you may come up with some controls to address that. There's a lot of ways to gain access to your trade secret data that don't involve waiting for your CEO to go to China. The Chinese threat can attack your systems remotely. So they're probably going to use the path of least resistance. So if you're worried about the Chinese threat, it's possible and very likely that it's much easier and less costly for the Chinese threat actor to perform an attack against your systems remotely, or to bribe or blackmail someone that works in your organization, or do something else that doesn't actually matter with your CEO that's in China. So when you look at a model like this, you can come up with a more practical set of solutions. So you can also ask yourself, how might we? So a lot of times organizations will say, it's been tried, we can't do it, it never will work. Instead, ask yourself, how might you do something? So one of the examples of my last attack vector was physical modification of the hardware of a computer. So how might you actually detect that? How could you mitigate it? And what is the risk after the CEO's return? So here's a few ideas. So if you put tamper-proof tape on a laptop, you would potentially notice that the laptop's been tampered with. This may sound really silly, but if somebody installs additional hardware inside a laptop and you weight it, it will probably weigh different than it did before. And when you bring the device back and you don't really have a good way of knowing if the BIOS has been modified or the hardware has been modified, why don't you just destroy the device? If the risk is that important to you and that costly, does it make sense to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on controls, or just every time the CEO comes back from China, just shred his computer or sanitize it and sell it on eBay or Craigslist? I think that your organizations may scoff if you come up with that as an idea, but if you can say this would be less costly because we'd only have to do it 20 times a year times $1,000, and the controls that you're more comfortable with will cost $1 million, then you might actually start to get somewhere. You can get a free computer. So to steal the in-use laptop that I mentioned before, one thing you can do is not use it in public. You could have code that has to be entered for it to stay alive, so somebody doesn't enter the code within X minutes, it locks or it sanitizes the data. You can have a proximity device. I actually use one of these myself. If my laptop is more than X feet away from a device that's in my pocket, the laptop actually locks itself. So if somebody steals my laptop, I'm in good shape. I'm going to actually skip a few of these here and move on to some I think are more important. Metrics. We measure a lot of stuff, but unless you're measuring things that actually provide you value, it's not doing any good. All metrics really should describe the outcomes that you want, your capabilities, or measure your progress towards the target state. So knowing the average number of days to patch a vulnerability provides you also almost no value. It's much better to take the percentage of vulnerabilities that are patched after some threshold time period and the median number of days that exist after that threshold period is expired. Because now you're actually measuring something. You're saying, if we don't patch within 14 days, bad things could potentially happen. What percentage of our vulnerabilities are not patched within 14 days? And for the vulnerabilities that take longer than 14 days, on average, how much longer are they actually taking? These are kind of metrics that actually tell you whether you're actually performing something that's providing value and tells you whether you need to make changes. Stakeholders. You have a lot of potential stakeholders. One thing you can do is take a RACI model, responsible, accountable, informed, or consulted with. And look at all the stakeholders in an organization, decide who's actually accountable for something versus who's somebody you just need information from. And when you look at your stakeholders, they have different needs or goals. Your CFO is very interested in fiscal responsibility and return on investment. Your auditor is interested in assurance of controls. If you know what they're interested in, you can craft your approach to working with them more effectively. And then there's ways that you can actually perform this. You can do it ad hoc, or you can actually have formal approaches to working with your stakeholders. I like to make things benefit my stakeholders or trick them into thinking that it was their idea. So that when I work with a CIO, I know that it's very expensive for them to have a service desk. And so when I say I want a longer password, and I say I'm willing to give up password expiration, what they're hearing is less calls to the service desk. I can redeploy those people, or I can lower my costs. And I believe I'm reducing the risk. Now, sometimes people say only gather data if you have a use for it. I completely disagree. Gather data because it can help you understand what your baselines are, identify patterns and correlations, and determine new questions to ask. So you might find out 19% of your users have a certain taxonomy for their password, or that you're 317% more likely to have a user require a password reset if they change their password going into a vacation or a weekend, which means you could potentially force all password resets to occur on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Low-hanging fruit. All right, so back to the model. Passwords, firewalls, OS patching, and antivirus. I believe they're really designed to accomplish these kinds of outcomes, and I believe there's some other things that we can do. Not saying these are what you should do, but these are some other controls that could potentially replace or supplement the controls that I had listed. And here's the kind of model that I would normally put together to look at these controls. It's not just simply, do they reduce risk? I like to look at, what is my confidence that I could implement that control and be successful? Is it going to cause user friction or pain? How hard is it going to be to implement? How hard is it going to be to administer that control? How much friction is it going to cause with other stakeholders? And how much is it going to cost? And the gist of it here is using this on a 1 through 5 scale, bolding where it was higher for one versus the other alternative. I identified 2 that I actually think are worth pursuing: one-time passwords and mitigating the Java risk. And most people think you can't mitigate the Java risk, but they're completely wrong. There's some new things you can do in Java. One is deployment rule sets, which actually let you say that this version of Java can only be accessed when you're accessing this URL or when you're accessing this specific application. You can block user agents at your proxy. 90+% of the attacks involving Java are going to happen over the web. Very few legit websites are accessed that need Java. You can look at filtering data out of your proxy, identify the sites to whitelist and whitelist them. And Microsoft Emmet, people say don't use it because you might have false positives and break things. If you install it to only block the Java threat, it works really well. So you can do these things. Here's what they do. I would look at a model like this, and the result of it is, I would say the number one thing I'd recommend is to block Java at the proxy. Very easy to do. You can do it in about an hour. Doesn't require a lot of change or administration. And then you work through these options. You start small, and then you work your way down. So start somewhere is very important. Local admin passwords. You may have the same local admin password everywhere and had it for the last 10 years. A lot of different ways to crack that nut. Here's some things you can do. The easier ones are at the top. The harder ones are at the bottom. We don't like to go against the grain. You think back to the Get a Mac campaign where they said Macs are secure. They weren't really secure, but no one was attacking them. The same thing exists with technologies you can implement. If you can implement the same technology everyone else does, that's what the bad guys are trying to exploit. There's very good reasons for using that technology, but you may want to consider some technology that no one else is using, because no one may be trying to exploit it. And even though it's insecure, but it's not being exploited, so therefore it's low risk. Okay. I have 4 slides left, so I'm getting close. Step out of the echo chamber. It's great that we're all here. We talk about information security. Maybe every once in a while, talk to some people from other fields. Go to a conference that has nothing to do with information security. There's a lot of disciplines that are relevant to information security. Spend some time talking to people that are in those disciplines, reading information, or just boning up on them, and I believe you'll find that it actually has a positive benefit for you. Okay, people are risky. We don't often look at it that way. We know they're all risky, but some people are this risky, and some people are that risky. If you have really risky people that are accessing a system, that system inherits that risk. So if you have a different system that's used by people who are less risky, it's a less risky system. There's a lot of information you can gather about the relative level of risk of the people in your organization, and you can cascade that down to your systems, and then you can also take action and do different things for the risky users versus the less risky users. It's not one size fits all in information security. So one last comic essentially says that usability is more important than security, or actually it says the opposite of that. Usability really is. And the challenge I want to leave you with is think and act different, share experiences with me and others, do InfoSec better, and you'll get better outcomes. That's it. I'll have a few minutes to take questions or have conversation after the meeting, then I have to catch a plane. I appreciate your time. Thanks.